Hi, all. Since we didn't get a chance to really get through this lecture discussion, I thought it'd be easier if I just recorded this session so that you can look back on it when you have a moment, maybe during class, when you're doing your writing assignment. Maybe you want to watch this first just so you can get a verbal reinforcement of maybe what you're reading, make sure you're getting it in the way that you should. But this is the fall of the Qing dynasty, the Opium Wars, the conquering of Europeans over China that will pave the way into the 20th century for foreign policy decisions, domestic policy decisions that the Chinese are going to make that will affect their role in society and even affect where they stand today. So let's get started. Um, Giving some context, remember contextualization. How did we get to this point where the Qing is falling? Well, where did the Qing come from? So if you remember from the song Yuan Ming Qing, uh, Yuan dynasty is going to be the Mongols. After the Mongols are kicked out, we have the Ming dynasty. The Ming is we're getting back to being really Chinese. We'll never be ruled over by foreigners again. Although the next dynasty itself is going to be a group of foreigners ruling over the Chinese. They're trying to get back to being traditionally Chinese. So getting back to Confucianism, getting back to the way that things were, bringing back the civil service exam, and all these really typical Chinese characteristics. They're going to stop land-based trade, so anything that was going on along the Silk Road is now over. We're going to have more border security, and so they're going to be predominantly conducting trade through the ports that they feel that they can monitor better. They're going to create those big treasure ships that uh, Zheng He is going to go on, and he's going to do his pilgrimage to Mecca and all this other kinds of stuff. But they'll be creating those huge treasure ships that are so much bigger than anything the Europeans are creating at the time. And they will trade their silks and porcelains and things and tea in Southeast Asia and even into the Indian Ocean trade system, Africa, and inadvertently it will get to Europe. Once Europeans start infiltrating the Indian Ocean trade network, the Chinese are going to be more and more encouraged to kind of lock down their borders. The Chinese government's going to start running out of money, and so they're going to stop building those treasure ships, and they're going to focus in on domestic stuff, and so they're going to kind of port those ships and not use them. They're going to fall into disuse and disrepair, and they're never going to be fixed again. And so the Ming is a story of trade, story of exploration, but then also a story of we're going to lock down again. And things start getting really bad. We know the dynastic cycle is always the same. And so the Ming is going to fall mainly because their government is corrupt. They're locked in the Forbidden City. Eunuchs are there giving bad advice. And there are ill-qualified people that are in the Forbidden City. The more they're secluded from the rest of society, the less they understand the needs of society. And the more society falls into disrepair and people are starving and they feel the government's not doing what they should be doing. They try to storm the Forbidden City. They ask the Manchus for help. The Manchus are a group of military-based society that is above China. It's just above Korea, actually, on the mainland. And they're going to ask them for help. The Manchus are going to come down. They're going to establish order, and then they're going to take government control. And so the Manchus are not Chinese. They're foreigners again. And the Qing is going to be the last Chinese dynasty. It won't even be really a Chinese dynasty. It will be the last dynasty in China, and then we're going to move into the 20th century, which is where we'll get to the Chinese Revolution and all that happens there. But the Qing or the Manchus will take on the name Qing because it sounds more Chinese, and you're more likely to follow somebody if they sound like you. And so they will adopt a very Chinese name. They're going to have Chinese government officials at the local level. And so it'll be similar to what the Mongols do in terms of how they facilitate the government. But one of the big things is, again, isolationism, keeping Chinese culture pure, very much controlling terms of trade. The British are going to be really knocking at the door trying to get into this trade, and the Chinese are really not going to be interested. And so here's Manchuria, as you see there at the top, right above North Korea. That's where they're coming from. And so in terms of the dynastic cycle, again, this is the last dynasty that we're going to be examining this. But remember, the only thing that changes is the amount of time it takes. We know that some dynasties make it around the cycle in like 10 years. Some of them take 750 years. And so it really just depends on how slow the disintegration is. But in this case, you know, the Qing are going to be around for a while. The last part of the existence of the Qing really won't be active control, because by that point, the Europeans are pretty much controlling everything. and using the Qing as a puppet or a face of government, because the Chinese would not want to follow the Europeans. So they'll keep their government there because, again, of course, that government's going to allow them to do whatever they want. And so the decline is all the same. This is not anything new. This is the dynastic cycle once again. And so we know that the Qing is starting to decline, and they won't officially leave until the very beginning of the 20th century, but bureaucracy is going to fall apart. We have the civil service exam is going to be riddled with corruption. People are paying their way into their government positions. The sons of high officials are kind of finding a way to be uh, in those positions of power without actually deserving them. The meritocracy breaks apart. Examiners are being bribed. And so basically, the emperor is being advised by these very powerful, very ill equipped, ill educated individuals. And so we do have a lot of bureaucratic problems resulting from that. And so another big thing, one of the elements that we always look for is decline in infrastructure. We know that the government is having problems when they are not spending money on key elements that keep society physically put together. And so things like roads or bridges or important buildings, infrastructure, piping, sewage. If that goes into disrepair, we know that the government's really in trouble. And so as the empire begins to decline, we can see that happening, especially as projects go unrepaired and that money is funneled into other places. And the military is defunded. We know that that was even happening in the Ming when they started taking away money from building treasure ships and going on those explorations. The dikes are falling apart. And so that's what helps prevent overflooding of the fields. And once you start having that happen, you have less yielding of food, and then you have starvation. And the dikes are not private; those are publicly taken care of. And once the government stops facilitating that, we have a lot of agricultural problems. So we have flooding, and that's going to result of a lot of famine and disease. Famine, especially because obviously they're starving, but disease because the water is unclean, because um, when you are ill nourished, you are more likely to be sick. Your body is not able to fend off illnesses as effectively, and so it's going to lead to a lot of deaths. So food shortages are going to cause mass migrations, and so people aren't going to be able to afford to stay on their land, so they're going to end up selling it to wealthy landowners, and that's going to create a lot of problems in the long run as well. But the biggest thing in the immediate is that people are flooding the cities. They're unemployed, they're homeless, they're conducting banditry or like stealing because they're desperate for food. And so the cities become really unsafe and riddled with crime. We're not talking about murders, we're talking about theft and people trying to survive. And again, the rise of crime is an indication that the government's not doing what they should be doing. And that's also an indication on the dynastic cycle that maybe that dynasty is coming to an end. There had been a population explosion up until 1850. The population had doubled, and now we're at 415 million people. The fast ripening rice for a long time was really causing the population to boom, but now we're having a lot of problems as more and more agriculture is needed, and so more and more planting is happening. But they're also realizing that that's not as effectively solving the problem of this massive population. Deforestation, erosion, soil exhaustion are coming from overuse of the land, not resting the soil, over cultivating, and the government just can't keep up. And so a lot of groups are going to be unhappy with the Manchus. The biggest problem is that they're just not Chinese. They don't look like them. They don't act like them. And so a lot of groups are being driven off their land. They're not trusting the government to solve the problem. The presence of foreigners is also an indication that people are not trusting the government to do what's in their best interest. Being Chinese has meant we are going to do our own thing. And for the Chinese to see a lot of missionaries, a lot of foreign merchants in the ports is an indication that the government's allowing too much outside influence. And for them, that's a big sign of decline. People are resorting to violence and revolt and rioting. That obviously is also an indication that the dynasty is coming to an end. And so we have new barbarians in the threat of opium. So Um, it's an interesting dynamic, Europeans and Chinese, because both of them believe that they are kind of the pillars of civilization, that they are the true model of what civilization should be. And so while the Chinese look at the rest of the world and say, how could you live like that? That's disgusting. The Europeans look at the Chinese and say, you're barbaric as well, or not as well, because we're not. How do you live this way? You're not Christian. You're not this. You're not that. And so both groups are kind of calling themselves barbaric or each other barbaric. And certainly that's going to affect the way that they treat each other. The Chinese have no interest in engaging with the Europeans because they believe that they are not civilized. The Europeans very much want to engage with the Chinese, but not on equal terms. They believe that they should have the upper hand. And so the problem is that Europeans have caught up. For a long time, we could say that the Chinese were far and beyond where the Europeans were. But unfortunately, as the Chinese had locked down their borders, now we have a situation where the Europeans, the industrial revolution, and everything's happened, where the Europeans have far surpassed the Ottomans, the Chinese, in weaponry and all this other technology. They've caught up and passed them. And cultural purity has been and cultural tendencies have been the top priority for these other civilizations, and therefore they have come at a cost. And so Europeans are coming from an equally sophisticated culture when they come into China again in this time period. And Britain is a lot more stable, a lot more technology, a lot more money, a lot more military organization. And so the Chinese really, unfortunately, I don't think even realized how far behind they had gotten. And so one of the big things is that the British need another market to sell their stuff. They desperately want those Chinese goods still. So porcelain, silk, tea, all that stuff. They still want to bring that out of China, but they also want to sell their stuff. They're now manufacturing tons of stuff, and they need new markets of people to sell to. The colonies of the Americas, those are all independent now. South America has independence. They need to come up with new areas, new people that will demand their stuff. And the Chinese just really aren't that interested. And the Chinese also don't really realize how much Europeans are making in profit from the products that they're producing. And again, there is this discrepancy, this trade deficit taking place between these groups because, like I said before, the Chinese don't really want European stuff, but the Europeans very much want Chinese stuff. And so the British, the only thing that the Chinese want is silver, and so the Europeans have to forfeit that if they are going to engage in trade with the Chinese, and for them that's an unfavorable term of trade. And so here's what the British come to the conclusion to do. They want to give the Chinese something that they're going to want, and they're going to want a lot of. And something that the British know that they have that the Chinese don't is opium. They have colonized India by this point, and so they have a huge amount of access to opium plants. And the native Indian groups have been using opium for centuries for various ceremonial purposes and things like that, and they know the power of that product. Opium comes from a poppy seed, and it's the core component of what will become heroin later on. And so it has a lot of hallucinogenic and other chemical impacts, and is significantly addictive. And so the British know that they have a huge supply of this product. They won't even allow it in their own country. Opium is illegal in Britain. But they know that they can get the population of China addicted to this product, and therefore they're going to demand that they trade that, and they're going to engage in more trade with them. So it's a free product that they can get their hands on, sell for money that they will be able to make pure profit off of, and then also inadvertently open up trade to other things. So they begin smuggling in opium in the 1730s. They're going to start by, hey, that I'm engaging with this one merchant because I'm getting porcelain from them or silk from them. Hey, try this one product that I have. If you're interested, I can get you more. It's going to start off as kind of an informal, like, let's, slide it in very casually with these merchants that we're engaging with. And then suddenly people are talking about it and they immediately get hooked. The Qing are going to respond by making opium illegal because opium makes people completely unproductive. Um, they will start to create things like opium dens where people just show up and they just smoke all day, and it makes you sleepy, it makes you inactive. If you've seen the scene in Wizard of Oz where they're coming across, excuse me, a poppy field, and Dorothy starts to fall asleep. That's kind of symbolic of, I mean, the poppies there are meant to are meant to mimic or symbolize opium, but it just makes you very tired and weak and uninterested in doing things other than smoking opium. So the government's going to make it illegal, and that doesn't really matter because these merchants are hooked on it and they're going to smuggle it in whether it's legal or not. And by 1820, they're averaging 4,500 chests of opium, and a chest weighs about 133 pounds. And then in just less than 20 years, that number is going to rise to 40,000 chests, or over 5.3 million pounds of opium. So we're talking about an exponential increase in trade between the Chinese and the British in illegal drugs. And so the Chinese are going to realize the opium trade was a major threat. It's making their population ineffective. It's also making them be at the mercy of the British, because now the Chinese are willing to trade anything to get their hands on opium, and that's taking away that upper hand that they had for so long in terms of foreign trade. And so they realize that this is just not good for society. This is bad for everyone. And also, opium starts off as a drug of a particular class of people, but then suddenly it starts to infiltrate other classes, and we're talking about people just not working. And when you have people not working, you have a society that's not making money, not producing goods, and not being at all productive. And so this is a big, big problem. And so the trade balance is reversed. The silver that was flowing into the country is now completely flowing out, because what did the British ask in exchange? They asked for silver as well. And so a lot of the money that China had made from that exchange before has now completely vacated. And sources of capital for public works decreased, agricultural productivity declined, unemployment is on the rise. All that people want to do is smoke opium. And in addition to being completely unproductive, opium has so many health detriments. You literally rot from the inside out. Opium creates this black tar inside your body and inside your intestines and all the other parts of your body, and your extremities rot. Your teeth become black and they fall out. You have bleeding gums. People that are severely addicted to opium have their feet amputated or their hands amputated. I mean, it is really awful, and you just die a slow, gruesome death from smoking opium. It is really, really disgusting. And there is lots of documents talking about these opium dens, the people in it, and how they're just blackened, and it's just lining the inside of their body. It's really, really gross. So addiction reached everyone, but especially the wealthy officials. 1% of the population is going to be addicted. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but we're talking about 415 million people in the country. And if we're talking about 1% of that, that's a lot of people that are just incredibly addicted. That won't do anything else except for whatever it takes to smoke opium. People will be selling their farms, people will be selling their factories, their businesses, just to get enough money to get more opium. I mean, it is all encompassing. It's bad for the economy, it's bad for society, it's bad for politics, because it's infiltrating all aspects. As early as the 20s, it's apparent that the opium trade had to stop. So again, making it illegal didn't seem to deter. It only ramped up the activity, and so the government needs to take more fervent action. They are going to send foreign dignitaries to enforce the ban on opium and to travel to Europe and try to convince Europeans to stop sending opium into China. And as you can imagine, they were very receptive to that idea. And by very receptive, I mean not receptive at all. And so they will refuse to stop sending opium into the country. The British will rebuff them. They won't even see them. They'll tell them to just leave because, again, they consider them to be barbaric. And then the emperor is going to blockade Canton, and confiscate and burn thousands of chests of opium. So kind of like the Boston Tea Party, just dump it in the ocean, and that obviously will create conflict on both sides. And so the Europeans are going to respond, and demand that not only is that repaid, but that they have property rights and free trade in China. They are demanding that in exchange, like their Chinese are asking for forgiveness, but they're not. And the British are demanding the Chinese stop their anti-opium campaign, or they will invade. And for the Chinese government, they're like, this has to stop at no matter what cost. And so we have got to be prepared to do whatever means necessary to stop the infiltration of opium into their country. And so the Opium Wars break out in 1839, and the Chinese are very, very ill-equipped. Remember, all the treasure ships are gone, so they have no large navy, no nothing. They have Chinese junks that are up against British gunboats. There is no competition. I mean, this is bringing a knife to a gunfight. This is more like bringing like a butter knife to a gunfight, to a machine gun fight. You are beyond unprepared. The war is going to rage for 2 years, and you might be saying to yourself, well, they did pretty well with a butter knife. Well, this is only because the British barely send anybody to engage in this war. It's not worth it for them to risk lives. It's kind of like how they treat, unfortunately, the American Revolution. Well, fortunately for us, they just don't send their A game. And so the war just piddles on for years and years. And a lot of it also deals with the fact that the Chinese just will refuse to surrender. And the war is really going to embarrass the Chinese. The military servants they have are called bannermen, and they're similar to the janissaries in terms of the military class of folks, but they are embarrassed by this exchange. It is just horrendous. They have swords, knives, spears, clubs, and they're using those on the British if they can get close enough, but most of the time they just can't. And so the British want to keep most of the fighting on the sea because they have gunboats. That's where they have the biggest advantage. They don't really want to engage in face-to-face combat on land. Unfamiliar territory. China has a lot more people than they do, and so they know that if they can keep them out on the water, that they can defeat them. Even though the British do have a much more disciplined and organized military. So they're going to end up going on land eventually because you can't take over a country unless you go on land. By the time they get there, they are going to be victorious there too. And so Nanking or Nanjing is where the emperor is, and he's going to be forced to call for peace. A second Opium War breaks out because the Chinese are like, we've got to try again. We got to keep trying this. We just can't settle for the way that things are. And the results of that one, the Chinese defeat allows the Europeans to have free reign of China. Obviously, the Chinese are not going to win. This one's going to be a lot shorter. And it's really just because the Chinese refuse to give up. And again, they're embarrassed. They lose. And this is the last straw where the Chinese are like, listen, or the Europeans, the British, are like, okay, we're done. Like this, obviously there's no way you can win. So we just need to end this now. So what they come up with the Treaty of Nanjing, and that's in 1842, and this is detrimental. And so similar to what's going to happen in Japan in terms of an unfair or unbalanced trade agreement, the British completely set the terms of this exchange to benefit them and no one else. So what do they get? They get Hong Kong. It's a permanent British settlement now, and that's an island off the coast of China. And for a long time, even today, if you go there, it looks very European. People almost even speak with a British accent there because they occupied that territory for so long. They are going to control 5 trading ports, so 5 more cities are going to open up to foreigners. Before, it was just the Canton system, so British and any Europeans that wanted to trade had to go through Canton. That was the way that the Chinese regulated trade. And now the British are going to open up 5 more ports to trade with because they can control those. And they're going to have rights of extraterritoriality. This is really the nail in the coffin because this means that the British don't have to abide by Chinese rules when they're in China. They get to abide by British rules when they're in China. Extraterritoriality means that you live by whatever rules are governing your behavior when you're at home. So it's kind of like a dignitary or a diplomat when they're here at an embassy. They abide by the laws of their home nation. And so the British get to come in and completely disregard and undermine Chinese authority and do whatever it is they want. That's how the Qing dynasty basically becomes a puppet state. The British are controlling everything, and the Manchus are just there occupying space. The Qing had to pay a tariff of 5% on imports. Again, this is part of the agreement. And a later treaty grants Britain most favorable nation status. What this means is that in terms of first dibs, the British are going to get it. So any privileges that are given to foreigners, the British are going to have first access. And then they get to have whatever's left over is given to other countries like the French, like the Germans, like any of these other groups that are going to try to occupy and trade in China. And even the Americans will be part of that. So by 1890, 90 ports are available to more than 300,000 European and American traders. Missionaries and diplomats are also part of that exchange. So again, we're having now an inward flooding of foreign influence. Europeans have no interest, though, in colonizing China beyond the ports. They don't want the burden of overseeing millions of people. They don't want the burden of figuring out agriculture, of feeding the people, of protecting all that territory. They have no interest in that. All they want is the market of people to sell to, and they want the ports, and they want the access to goods. Beyond that, they don't want anything. And so they will just occupy on the coastline because that's the most profitable. And so we know that Britain, France, Germany, Russia had also activity in those ports. The trade is going to be overseen by the British. Think about them as like managers of this whole trading system. Opium trade is going to be legalized because obviously the British are going to force that upon the Chinese. By 1879, 87,000 chests of opium are being shipped into China. So we're talking about just free flow of drugs. And the most humiliating aspect was the Qing was forced to accept European ambassadors at the court. And they were not, Europeans did not have to respect the Chinese emperor as being a legitimate emperor. Ambassadors were seen as spies. Exchange of diplomats was a concession that European nations were equal in statute to China, and this is a big moral blow for the Chinese. So China, after the Opium Wars, they're going to become basically a shell of their former selves. They're going to be run almost completely by European powers, mainly the British. And so the most important, profitable parts of their empire were controlled by outside forces. And so again, this is just devastating for China and the Chinese people. And the coastal cities, Europeans and Americans maintain offices and factories, so they're only going to have these menial jobs for the Chinese. They're going to be taking the most profitable ones. Again, not really on the interior. The interior is all farmers, and they don't care about that. Foreigners are going to build nice homes in restricted areas. Christian missionaries are going to come in and build lots of churches, convert lots of people. They're also going to build hospitals, shelters, soup kitchens, and that might sound great, but there's always strings attached, and again, it's more and more and more foreign influence. And the Chinese think of them as pretty evil because they are undermining Confucian belief systems and temples and other kinds of things. And this is not new. This is all the same stuff. Missionaries are becoming increasingly the target of resentment because they're pressuring people to convert. And obviously, anything that they're bringing in. The missionaries had been there for forever. But they had been relegated to very specific aspects of society. You stay in the you stay in the court because we're interested in your sciences and your knowledge of the world. But we don't want you actually converting people. Well, now that the British are calling the shots, missionaries get free reign to do whatever they want. All right, so then next week, we're going to be talking about the Taiping Rebellion and the way that the Chinese are going to respond to this, because you can't imagine that the citizens of China are going to be like, oh man, that sucks. Like, too bad, so sad. Like, I guess we'll just have to ride this out. They are going to be angry because they blame the government for this all happening. And so all these rebellions are going to happen that basically create civil war within China. It's the people against this puppet government. And people wanting foreigners out. And so the one commonality is that the British will actually support the Chinese government to shut down these rebellions. Why? Because they want that government to stay. If another government is put in place, they have to write all new agreements. They have to convince that government that they're supposed to be doing this. They want the Qing to stay because they have it all figured out. They have an agreement with them. They need them to stay in power. And so the British are actually going to shut down these attempts to overthrow the government because they want things to stay exactly as they are. They have everything that they want in this exchange right then. So we'll pick up there next week when we talk on Tuesday. Have a great long weekend and enjoy your assignment while I'm gone.